Hello, and welcome to episode 25 of the PowerScore LSAT podcast. I'm Dave Kaloran in Napa Valley.
And this is John Denning in Los Angeles.
Tonight we're going to talk about the three LSATs this fall, the September, October, and November LSATs, and that means this is crystal ball time.
Yes,
Are you ready, John?
I think so.
You think so?
I think so.
Well, the most important question is, if you think you're ready, what are you drinking?
Yeah, this is where my hesitation comes in, because I've gotten aggressive today. Given that there are three LSATs to be discussed in this episode, I started looking for a three-part cocktail, as it were. And the most classic from my experience is the good old, I guess you could call it good, Three Wise Men, or Three Wise Men, I guess it's plural with three, which includes, as my version of it, a shot of Jim Beam, a shot of Jack Daniels, and a shot of Johnny Walker Scotch.
So basically, hell on earth.
Basically, yeah. I am not the fourth wise man, clearly. This is a horrible, horrible mistake.
I have had this shot before, and I've regretted it every single time I've ever had it.
If memory serves, though, I think you had a slightly different version of this.
Yes, I had Jack Daniels, Jim Beam, and this was what made it even worse, Jose Cuervo.
A fourth wise man substituting it.
It was unwise. There was no fourth wise man, there was a fourth unwise man, and
right.
that was me
That
for
was
taking
Dave.
the stupid shot.
Yeah, so I've substituted Johnny for Jose in this case. But, yeah, it's not as bad as it sounds. But
Yeah, it
there's
is.
quite a margin between that and good. So I'm living somewhere in that margin.
It's not horrible, but that doesn't mean anything about it being positive.
Yeah, I know what you're drinking, and I'm a bit envious. Tell
Mine's
us.
more tasty.
Mm-hmm.
I'm drinking a classic whiskey sour. In part because you have a bunch of whiskeys in yours, but also the sour part relates to my feelings over the Digital LSAT and the transition to it over the last,
fantastic.
6 months. So I've gotten everything I want. And as usual, if I'm going to drink something like whiskey, I need to mix it with something that will make it enjoyable for me.
Sweeten it up.
Yeah, and this definitely works. So I think we also have an inspired music choice, although this is it's kind of old school in a certain respect.
For sure. I was surprised to learn that we haven't actually used this song yet.
We've been talking about
Right.
this one for quite a while because of the Digital LSAT transition. And as we move into the September LSAT, this is the first full-fledged test of the new era.
Mm-hmm.
We know that June was the last paper test. We know that July was the transitional test. September is the very first full digital test in North America. Everybody who takes this test, aside from certain accommodation testers, will take the tablet test. And so the song that we've chosen is a very old song by the Buggles, which I've been laughing about their name just because I think when you actually say it a few times, you're like, that's a ridiculous band name.
Well, it sounds like a kid's band or something, right? Like
It totally does.
the Muppets, or who was the Teletubbies or something.
When I've thought about band names and bands that I'd like to be in, Buggles never actually made the list or even crossed my mind.
Just probably good. What's the song?
The song is Video Killed the Radio Star, which is their one really big hit. But the most important thing about this is that when MTV first launched as a network in the early 1980s, this was the very first video that they played.
Yeah, I knew that.
And it was their idea of we're going to kill radio. It didn't quite work out, but I love the sentiment of that's it, you're done. Because that's kind of what LSAC has done to the paper LSAT. They're like, we're going to kill it. So this is digital killing the paper star.
That's right.
In this song. So, a little enjoyable there.
Yeah, the song thematically is great. The song musically, I don't like it.
It's fun.
And you're going to be like, oh, it's great. No, this is genuinely mediocre at best.
It's campy.
It's just not a good song.
It's a very campy song.
Yeah, I guess.
The amazing thing is that the two guys who are the stalwarts of that band, one of them is Trevor Horn, who's an incredible producer of all sorts of hit albums, especially from the 80s and the 90s. He also produced the Frankie Goes to Hollywood album, Welcome to the Pleasure Dome, which is one of my favorite albums of all time, in case anybody's tracking that. And the keyboardist is a guy named Jeff Downs, who used to be in Asia and is like a super group keyboardist. So these guys are really talented. And we're still talking about their song, so how bad could it really be?
I mean, no, never mind. I was going to say, we still talk about natural disasters.
No comment.
Yeah.
We're actually going to talk about natural
I was
disasters.
about to say, it's on my mind and yours, I know.
You think the Buggles are a disaster? Well, here's a real one.
Yeah, the Buggles ain't got nothing on Dorian. Let's talk about this hurricane.
Very briefly, the reason we're going to talk about it is because it's obviously sitting off the coast of Florida as we speak, but it is heading up the coast. From our perspective on the West Coast, it's not going to have a direct impact on us, but since we're both former residents of the Southeast, obviously we want people to be very careful out there. Any hurricane can be incredibly dangerous. It's going to affect our company operations in Charleston, South Carolina, however. We're under a mandatory evacuation in our main office. Already, UPS and FedEx have shut down shipping. They've reversed the lanes of the interstate. And if you're not familiar with that, it means they don't go both directions. They take the incoming road to Charleston and they reverse it so that all traffic flows outward.
Yeah.
So it's going to affect our business operations. We will still be up and running. So if you need to call us, ask us questions, talk about courses, what have you, we will have people on the lines. It'll be a little bit of a skeleton crew at times as we transition, and the shipping department will shut down here because, well, there's no UPS or FedEx to pick it up.
Yeah.
So just be aware of that if you're dealing with us for the next few days or so until this hurricane goes by and hopefully doesn't cause any damage. And this is all, we hope, a scare, but not a real impact that actually happens.
Yeah, I know you are the same. I've got friends and family up and down the southeast coast, so I'm thinking about it a lot, obviously. And anybody listening to this out there who might be in the periphery of the hurricane, certainly in the target of it, be safe, be smart, please. Try to stay dry.
Yeah, it's not just the wind. Sometimes there's tornadoes, there's storm surge, there's all sorts of bad things that come along with these, even if it doesn't come ashore.
It is no fun.
So, but if you're not in that area, just be aware of the fact that we're being impacted from a company standpoint, and we do everything that we possibly can to stay up and running, and we obviously have contingency plans for this. So we will be open. Shipping will be affected, though. Let's move on to the more specific world that we inhabit, which is the LSAT world. Yeah. What's been going on there?
Not a whole lot of anything, frankly. We're in this lull period between tests, between score release and next test. So there's not much going on. One thing that you and I both noticed is the familiar.org site that LSAT has put together to test some of their digital interface stuff. Got a minor facelift, I guess you could call it.
Yes.
Seeing it on some browsers, not seeing it on others, but they have done some cosmetic work to that. It still won't give you a full test and score it, but at least it will track your raw score over the various sections of a test. So that's a step in the right direction.
Yeah, I don't understand why it doesn't score it entirely. It's like, well, you know how many you got right, so just give us the number. But they are slowly but surely moving towards having this operational in a fully usable sense, or at least to replicate the entire experience. Also, just as a reminder, if you have not canceled or confirmed your July LSAT score, you have until September 4th, which is going to be the day this podcast actually comes out. So those are really the two updates that we have. Familiar's been updated, but nothing's changed. They haven't added any tests. It'll track your answers now. Yay, won't give you a score. And if you took that July test, make a decision if you haven't already. You've had almost 2 weeks. Get it done.
Yeah.
Which is great. Now let's move on to the real juice.
Yeah, that all out of the way. To the juice.
None of that was exciting to me, but it had to be covered. So, how's that Three Wise Men treating you, though?
It's going down real slow.
Are you sipping it?
Real slow. Yeah, I know. I probably should just bite the bullet like a Band-Aid, right?
It's not a cocktail, man. It's a shot. Take the shot.
It's a kick in the teeth is what it is.
That's your choice, buddy.
I know.
All right, let's get into this kind of like fall regime of tests. We know that we're transitioning out of the digital test. We've talked a lot about it, so we're going to try to make this very concise. We're going to talk a little bit about what's happening as you go into September here, but this also applies to October and November.
For sure.
And then we're going to talk specifically about the content that we expect to see on these tests. So let's first off do a review of what we have with the 3 tests that are coming up.
Yeah, just logistically, let's do a quick overview of how these 3 are going to operate or be administered. We'll
All
start
right,
with
hit it.
we'll start with September. September is going to be the only Saturday test, which means it's going to start bright and early, September 21st, about 8:30 that Saturday morning is when you can, at least on paper, expect to kick things off. We'll talk a little more about the reality of that as we get into this. That is going to be a disclosed test in September. And what that means is when you get your score back, whenever that happens to be, you will also get a copy of the test and your answers from it, assuming you don't cancel your score. So that's a bonus, frankly. There's only 3 tests a year at this point that are disclosed. September is going to be one of them. June was disclosed. September will be one. We'll talk about the rest. But that's the very next test on the docket, about 3 weeks, 2.5 weeks from when this is going to go live. It's also the first test, something we discussed in a podcast previously, that is going to count towards your repeat limit. If you don't recall, LSAC has now imposed a ceiling of sorts on how many times you can take the test in one of their calendar years, which runs from June 1st through May 31st. September is going to count to that. You've only got 3 attempts a year. So if you take September, you're down to 2 more chances to take it until next June when it resets a bit.
Yeah, and that 3 test limit includes cancellations.
It does.
It does not include withdrawals.
That's right.
So if you sit for the test in any shape or form for even 5 minutes, it's going to count.
Yeah.
If you don't show up or you withdraw, what have you, it will not count.
Correct. So that's September, and I think these will become a little more interesting as you start to compare them. For instance, October, which is the next test after September, October 28th, is not given on a Saturday. It's on a Monday afternoon. Starts around 12:30 or so. My preference, to be sure. However, it is a non-disclosed test, which means you will get a score, you'll get its percentile, but you will not see a copy of the questions, your answer sheet, the scoring scale, the curve. None of that comes with it. This is much like July for those of you who maybe just took the July test. It also is non-disclosed. This one also counts towards your repeat limit, of course. So, again, something to consider as you go through it. A very different test, though, and we'll talk more about it relative to September. Different day, different disclosure, different time, etc. November, the third test in this triumvirate that we'll look at, is a lot like October. It's also given on a Monday afternoon. However, it is disclosed. November 25th, you will get a copy of that test as well. The scale, your answers, etc., when that score comes out. It also counts to the repeat limit, of course. So technically, you could burn through all 3 tests by the end of November here, if you take all 3 of these back to back to back.
It'd be done for a year.
It'd be done until June, anyway. Yeah.
Yeah, a calendar or a testing year.
Yeah, effectively a cycle at least, done for a year's worth of cycle.
One of the questions I often see people ask is there a functional difference between a disclosed and a non-disclosed test? We know, obviously, that the disclosed test, you get your results back, you can see the questions and what have you, whereas in a non-disclosed test, you cannot.
Right.
But is there an underlying fundamental difference in these tests? No, there is not. And so, at least from the difficulty and scoring and what have you of the exams, it does not matter to me whether you're taking a disclosed or non-disclosed test. Their idea is that they want the results of any given LSAT to be identical across time.
Mm-hmm.
And so they're not doing something sketchy on a non-disclosed test. It just means that probably they're going to reuse it in the future. So it's going to come out eventually, in all likelihood, but it might be years and years and years before that actually happens.
Sure. February being the classic example of this.
Yeah.
So, yeah, to me, I might add 2 small asterisks to that. One is there's obviously a big advantage to being able to see the test itself after the fact, especially if you want to review it for a future attempt, basically. So if you take September thinking you might test again in November, say, having a copy of that September test, along with your score and along with your results, gives you the ability to review it. It becomes a really valuable piece of data, frankly. You can't do that in October or this past July because you don't know what you answered or what questions were even there.
That's exactly right. Now, the other question that people like to ask is, well, as we get later and later in this stream, am I going to have an admissions and application problem? Is November too late, is really the gist of that question. And the answer is, it is not too late. Certainly, rolling admissions is still in force, and the earlier you can apply, the better. But I always say this, it is better to apply later with a higher LSAT score than it is to apply earlier with a lower LSAT score. So this is kind of a key point. By itself, the results of the November LSAT are not overly late. You're still in the first half of the applicant group. And depending upon the cycle, you could be in the first 1/3 of the applicant group. It really depends on how it breaks out. That's still relatively early. It's after Christmas where you've reached the midpoint, and really like the holiday break, the holidays through December as well as New Year's. That's where you start to see the midpoint hit, and then after New Year's, you're starting to get later and later.
Right.
So, just by itself, September, October, and November are each still on the early side of applications. So if you're looking at it, you're like, oh boy, I don't think I'll be ready by October, but I want to apply early. Think about November.
Seriously, yeah.
Yeah, better to take it later and get that higher score, at least put yourself in a position to get a higher score, than it is to rush yourself and take this test early and not be 100% prepared. This question has come up so many times recently, and I'm just going to reiterate it one more time. Your LSAT score is the biggest part of your application in terms of impact and results. It's going to have the biggest determination on the school you get into, and it's going to have the biggest determination on the type of financial package you get offered. This is the one place you don't want to skimp out on. You don't want to rush yourself. You want to give yourself the clearest shot at getting the score that you think you can achieve. So don't push it if you're not ready. That's kind of like the short lecture sermon on that topic.
No, I mean, that's pretty much the
true.
gold standard rule when it comes to this. Is a better score is more important than that extra month of earlier applications.
Yeah.
There are certain schools maybe where you'll miss early admission deadlines, for instance.
I'm okay with that.
Yeah, early decision deadlines. But aside from that, again, better score is always going to be the determining factor, I think.
Yeah, I once
Up
listened
to a point. Look, next March, then you start to really get yourself into some trouble at various places.
Yeah, and I've listened to the admissions directors of top 14 schools state this quite clearly. Look, if you can get 1 point higher, especially if it's around the median, we're fine waiting 2 more months for your score.
Sure.
Because numbers talk. That's what we report. We do not report your admissions kind of like deadline, like the day you actually applied.
Right.
I don't care about that. So just keep that in mind.
I think people forget about that sometimes. Look, these schools want to let you in. They're desperate to say yes to you if you can just give them the ability to, in good faith, in good conscience. They want your money. They want you there as a warm body in their class next year, but you just have to give them the ability to say yes to you. A higher score is what lets them do that.
Yeah, October with a score that's 2 points lower than you applying in December with a score that's 2 points higher. December with 2 points higher, you're
Every
better.
time. Every time.
Yeah, it's black and white.
Yeah.
Now, the one thing that everybody really does need to stop and think about if they are thinking about taking one of these future LSATs, especially October and November, and it hasn't been registered yet, register now.
Yeah.
Not just October having a lot of space problems. November is having a lot of space problems. And the other day, somebody from Denver told me that the Denver centers for January were now full. We know that LSAC is working on adding space. They've sent out a memo to that effect, and that's great. I love it. They've known about this problem, though, for like 6 to 8 weeks at this point. And I haven't seen a tremendous amount of movement. I've seen some movement. So if you're thinking, well, I might want to take November, register now or as soon as you possibly can. If you're thinking about January, also consider registering right now, because in some of the major cities, it looks like we're going to have the same problem. And on our last episode, I talked about why October and November were specifically having registration issues. So I'm not going to reiterate that, but it doesn't look like this is fixed yet. They're trying, but it is not taken care of as of today. So register as early as possible.
Yeah.
All right.
The more interesting thing about these tests, though, is really that they're all three going to be digital in North America, as you already mentioned. And we've now learned a fair amount about what that digital experience is like based off of test takers in July.
Yeah, it was an interesting...
That's a word for it.
I don't want to be too negative because it's too easy in some respects to be negative about some of this. I know that LSAC is trying very hard to get this right. It is in their best interest to get it right. They are struggling right now. And I think anybody that you were to ask there would probably tell you the same thing. It's been a challenge. They're having Issues come up that they did not anticipate in terms of like registration and wait lists, things they've never really had to deal with all that much before.
Mm-hmm.
And we know that during the July test, there were widespread issues. Now, they put out a blog that said it was great. They put out a press release that said it's a huge success. And I understand why you do those things. You know, they're trying to send a message to the overall group at large that, hey, this did go generally pretty well in our opinion. We have different standards in terms of how we look at that. My view is this, is if there is some type of deficiency, whether it's at a center or for an individual test taker, you failed. You're being paid a lot of money to get it right. Get it right. They're hoping that, they will move forward and they will get it right. It's never going to be perfect. I think we all know that. They at least are aware of the issues. But a lot of what we talked about in our July recap were serious problems, from issues with registering and showing up to the test, issues at 2 centers with the test even actually connecting to the system, problems with the tablets, problems with the screen glare, problems with the styluses.
Problems with the proctors.
And so a large number of issues are floating around out there. And going into these 3 fall tests, you need to walk in not expecting that you're going to have problems, but being prepared in case you have problems. I don't want you to go in as a test taker and be like, I'm going to be negative about this. I want you to go in empowered and be able to think to yourself, well, if this happens, I know exactly what to do. And if that happens, I'll do this. So what we really want to talk about is, yes, there were digital issues, but what can we learn from those as you, the test taker, prepare to walk into an exam where there is no uncertainty? You are now getting the tablet test, so you're going to have to deal conceivably with some of these issues if they pop up.
Yeah, let's hope that they've fixed much of what we saw go wrong in July, but on the off chance that they either haven't or maybe just to kind of keep people prepared as they walk in, that Boy Scout motto thing. Let's do it. Let's run through some of these. So what were some of the issues that we heard about in July, and what do we recommend people do to either mitigate them or preempt them or something? One of the biggest ones I heard was really just hardware related. There was a lot of screen glare. You go in these classrooms in a lot of places that have these bright fluorescent overhead lights, and you're sitting there with a tablet that has to remain on the table, on the desk. It's hard sometimes to read what's on the screen because it's just light reflection.
Yeah, you basically have either remains on the desk or you can go up to a 30-degree angle.
Right.
Is what they wanted to have done. And the reports were that some proctors were very strict about this, and other proctors were less strict, much more lax about it. So when you get in there, the very first thing to do is to look at the screen glare situation. And if you have problems, to try to make adjustments, move it up, move it down, see what you can do, shift yourself in the chair, look at where the lights are. If it's a huge problem for you, talk to a proctor.
Yeah,
Be like,
flag a proctor down.
I can't read this. And if you can't see the screen, or if you're constantly trying to adjust it, how smooth and enjoyable is your testing experience going to be? It's going to be worse. We know that. So immediately upon entering the room and getting your tablet, check the screen glare issue.
Yeah, when you talk about that 30-degree angle thing, that's still pretty flat to the table, if you can envision about a 30-degree wedge, which again is reflecting a lot. But what a lot of people were doing was turning the tablet so it stood up at more like a 60, 70, 80-degree angle, so more vertical. And then they weren't having the glare issues. Now, technically, letter of the law, I don't think that's supposed to be allowed. But like you said, a lot of proctors just didn't notice, didn't care, didn't know.
But some did.
Some did. But, nobody got sent home for it. They were just asked to adjust their tablets.
Exactly.
So that's one way maybe to avoid the screen glare thing, is see if you've got a proctor who's not so uptight.
Hope,
frankly.
Thoughts and prayers.
That's right. Thoughts and prayers. Yeah, and this is one of those where really it is better to ask for forgiveness than permission, frankly.
I think so too. And especially because if they tell you to put it down, it's not going to be a test violation.
No.
You're not doing anything other than I thought I could do that. So, and who knows, maybe they've changed the rules since the last time they came out. Things seem to be changing very rapidly over there. A lot of uncertainty. So I don't even really know what the test rules are these days. And there's no reason that you shouldn't at least check it out and see if it's something that will actually work.
Yeah, certainly no way to know what they'll be in November, say. So.
Yeah. Now, speaking of hardware, It wasn't just the screens that were a problem.
No, it was not.
The styli, the styluses, either of which is an appropriate term there, were problematic. And probably the way to summarize this would be to say that, in general, the view of the stylus was that the styluses sucked.
Yeah.
I think that's a simple, direct way of putting that out there. So just go in knowing that. And I've read quite a bit about this, and I've heard quite a bit from students who were like, well, it did certain things really well. Like for selecting answer choices, it seemed to work okay.
Yeah, to tap the screen, you were fine with it. To even call this a stylus, though, let's just be real, is a bit misleading. It's not even a stylus.
What would you call it?
I call it a very flimsy, cheap plastic pen that has a rubber nub on the eraser side end of it. That's what I would call it. To call this a stylus like an Apple Pencil or some sort of drawing tool, I think which is what a lot of people have asked me, like, so it's like an Apple Pencil kind of thing, or the sort of stuff you get with like a Samsung tablet normally. No.
Well, they were giving it away at the end of the test. Do you think they're going to give away a piece of high technology that's expensive?
No, I don't.
Of course not.
No. Although you had an interesting theory on partly why they give it away, which is a hygiene thing.
Yeah.
All these grubby hands, and then a proctor has to go collect and redistribute.
They don't like their test takers.
No.
That's that theory. I don't know.
Take your germ pen home with you.
As I've said many times, the law schools are their real clients. The students taking the LSAT are definitely second-class citizens and have been. And if anybody wants to argue with me about that, please come on the show.
Yeah.
I will give you 25 years of worth of history as to why I know that's the case.
Yeah.
And I think they're trying to change, and I give them credit for change. They're just not there yet.
Yeah. Well, the stylus definitely was not a step in that direction because, again, it sucked. So, what I've been advising people here is, number one, practice if you can before the test on some sort of tablet, just so you get used to a touch screen interface. It's great to do this on computer, like on LSAC's site or on our site, using, your mouse, for instance, to click and drag and stuff, but it's not quite the same as actually physically touching a tablet. And then get used to using your finger as the device.
You got 5 styluses right on your hands.
5 styluses.
And let's at least be clear about what the problem with the stylus was.
Sure.
Although tapping the answer choices seemed to work pretty well, when it came time for you to actually underline or highlight, it worked terribly.
Yeah.
One of our students actually, and I'll quote, said, "It failed miserably. I could not make it underline what I wanted, and it often marked several lines or the wrong line rather than what I wanted."
Yeah.
So that is a pretty bad scenario. And this was not something that was isolated. I heard this from, I would say, the majority of test takers. Yeah, it wasn't easy. And so a lot of people, when they had that problem, abandoned it and went to the finger stylus.
The finger stylus, that's right. Yeah, so to touch the screen, this little cheap stylus they give you was fine. To drag on the screen, which is what you do to underline or to highlight, it was terrible. I heard students talking about, like, I'd try to underline something and it actually jumped questions on me. It sent me back to the past question or sent me forward, things like that. Where not only was it imprecise, I mean, it was catastrophically failing. So, abandon it. The pen was fine, but the stylus was...
Part of it worked okay because pens are known to be cheap and they can make them for like 1 cent.
Yeah.
All right, so you got screen glare, you got the stylus to work with.
Speaking of the pens and the handwriting stuff.
Yeah, then we move to the next thing, which deals with writing on the scratch paper.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the scratch paper is basically unlined. You've got a booklet of like 12 to 14 pages, as I recall. The one thing that they did, which I'm not sure was very well planned out, strike that, which was not planned out very well at all. There's no thinking about it. Was that they watermarked the scratch paper with the letters LSAC, or at least, the Law School Admission Council.
Right.
And in the watermark, it's rather dark. And so when you write on it, especially with pencil, it's difficult to see your writing against the watermark. And okay, look, did anybody in Newtown sit down and take a digital test and use the scratch paper that they'd created? I don't think so, because they would have run into this problem very quickly. And of course, the second question is why are we branding scratch paper?
That gets collected at the end. It's not like somebody could run off with it and then they'd know the source, the attribution.
I don't understand the thinking here. And I'm trying to give them credit for stuff, and then I run into stuff to incidents like this, and I'm at a loss for some of the things that I'm seeing. This is one of them, and I'm making a point about this because I'm hoping they're listening and that they say, "Oh boy, maybe we should change that," or put the watermark in the corners,
Sure.
so that we have nice, clean scratch paper throughout the middle. However, let's just assume that's not going to happen in the next 3 months because they probably printed 1 million copies of that scratch paper to save money. And so we're stuck with it for a while. What that means is as you are writing, you have to consider some things. The first is maybe you need to avoid the watermark. I heard this from multiple people who said, writing in the watermark, I would just lose the information, so I had to write around it.
Yeah, the comment I heard is the watermark is the exact color of pencil on paper.
Brilliant.
Yep. That's what you want.
Absolutely marvelous.
We get a watermark in a nice pencil-y graphite. That's perfect. Right through the middle of the page, please.
Right, so either you avoid that area of the page, which is inconvenient and annoying, something that I didn't pay $200 for, or alternately, you are allowed to bring in like highlighters and stuff, so maybe highlight and try to underline it in a way that it really stands out. But there are different things to think about here. It's just something you're going to have to deal with on test day, but don't walk in thinking, oh, it's going to be really easy, and then run into this problem and have to adjust on the fly. Think about it beforehand.
Yeah, one comment I did hear from a few people was that the pen was more legible than pencil. So the ink pen they give you as part of their stylus equipment seemed to be a little bit more visible over the watermark than the pencil would be. But you don't want to find yourself in a position of having to switch back and forth between 2, 3, 4 writing utensils. So plan on a watermark interrupting the flow through the page, diagram around it best you can.
I'd bet you $5 that because they originally did not plan on allowing pencils, they tested this with pen and it looked great. And then later on, when they realized the uproar about you better use, allow pencils, which is, come on, man, you're making the LSAT, know your test. Then they were all of a sudden like, uh-oh, we'll use pencil, then it'll be fine. Okay, everybody, problem solved. And nobody thought, oh, wait, our scratch paper is the same color as pencil lead.
This was not an issue I faced when I did the first pilot test. The scratch paper then was just blank. It might have had like writing in a corner or something, but it was just blank. So it never occurred to me that at some point they'd put this obscuring, needless text in there.
Mm-hmm.
And yet here we are, doing the dance.
I'm holding back further comment.
Right.
But again, this is giving them the opportunity to correct this going forward. This is a mistake. It's a problem. Fix it.
Yeah. Most problematic I heard in logic games, of course, which is where the majority of your diagramming tends to occur on the test. So again, just plan accordingly. If you're not practicing with scratch paper, start doing it. And exactly. I'd get used to using a pen as well, just in case that becomes what you need to do.
Which is terrible because we don't want to use pen in logic games.
Of course not. You want to be able to erase. Fine.
Now, of course, all this adds up to something that's rather important, which is it sounds like the chances are decent that you may have an issue, whether it has, something breaks on your tablet, because we haven't even talked about any of those issues. There were so many of those where it froze or there were a problem of some sort, to the stylus issues, to the problems with screen glare and what have you. You may find yourself with, and certainly with the digital test, a higher than previous chance of having to talk to a proctor. Be prepared for that. If you run into any type of problem that is compromising your test experience, go talk to the proctor. Deal with it aggressively, hopefully before the test even starts if you start to see that there are issues. But if something freezes or your tablet doesn't look like it's working right or you can't see, immediately address it. Don't wait because it's not going to get better on its own. It'll only get worse. And you want to have as few interruptions as possible throughout your testing experience.
Yeah, I hate to say it because it's not necessarily great life advice, but this is actually one of those days where a sense of entitlement is probably on some level deserved. You should walk in there expecting things to go right, and when they don't, raise your hand, make a little noise. They'll replace your tablet if it freezes. They will give you, options here. You can change seats if the glare's too bad. There are things you can do to help yourself out. Don't be afraid to ask for them.
Yeah, you need to walk in there like your name is Karen, and you've got a haircut that says, I want to talk to the manager.
Yeah, this is a can I speak to the manager haircut day.
That's exactly what it is. You need to walk in with that mindset of like, I'm not taking any of this. Let me speak to your manager right now. So
I was picturing that exact meme when I was like, nobody will get this. Nobody will know what I'm talking about.
I'm right there with you, buddy.
Me.
The last thing really is don't be surprised if you're forced to wait. There were multiple problems with registration, meaning people waited sometimes up to an hour or two just to get into the test center.
I heard 3 hours sitting outside the test center.
Yeah, which is completely crazy. And then, of course, there were problems in some of the test centers with even having the test syncing up with the main supervisor hub and getting everybody on the start page. So it's not really going to be a huge surprise if we see issues like that again this time around.
These are the kinds of things you'd like to think they've solved since July. What a learning experience, what an opportunity to improve. But, especially for September, I don't have a high degree of confidence that we're not going to see a lot of the same stuff plaguing this administration. So, you think about what this means. You show up at 8 a.m. to take an 8:30 test. You might not start until 10:30. Bring a snack. Bring some water. Prepare yourself to sit there for a while.
Yeah.
Bring a book.
One last point about all this, because I agree with all those points, is interestingly enough, I've just gotten a communique from LSAC, and one of the things they're saying here is that they will be sending additional information and clarification to the October and November registrants either this afternoon or basically in the next 24 hours or so. And I'm just reading off the email right now. So if you are registered, especially if you're like a waitlist person, you probably will hear an update relatively soon here. But the last thing that comes in with all these tests is after you've taken it, after hopefully everything's gone well, how long do you have to wait for your scores?
Well, ideally it won't be anything like July, which was about a 5-week wait, although down from the 6 weeks they promised. I think they're going to get it back to around 20 to 22 days, so about 3 weeks of a turnaround. The disappointment in this, of course, is a lot of people expect when they take a digital test, they'll get some instant feedback. Not the case. You're looking for the GRE in that, not the LSAT.
Yeah, we've talked about this previously, about their ability to do this, and then them not doing it. And we would like them to give a raw score at the end, which we know they can do. We'll continue to argue for that, and we'll see what our success level is. Probably measured more in years as opposed to weeks or months.
But yeah, anybody who hits, finish at the end or whatever, their time runs out and they're waiting to see what they got. Sit tight. You got about 3 weeks.
Yeah, and let's not, I don't want to make this all negative in terms of like be prepared for problems. Remember, there's some real benefits to the digital test. When it works smoothly, it's a fast check-in. You can get started very quickly. It's great to have the clock on the screen. You're able to transfer answers instantly because as soon as you select an answer, it's recorded. So no more mistakes, no more misbubbling and things like that. So there's a lot of great things that actually come with this digital format. It's just they need to work out some of the other things. So go in with a positive mindset, but be prepared and feel good about the fact that you're prepared for some of these issues. You're ahead of the curve compared to somebody who's in the middle of nowhere studying on their own who hasn't really accessed any information about this test. It's fine. Their loss. I'm sorry for them.
Yeah, for the people in July I talked to where it went well, there weren't any of these hiccups and issues. They really enjoyed it. A lot of people came out saying they prefer digital to paper for a number of the reasons, some of which you just listed. But yeah, it's more like if things do go wrong, what are you going to do to compensate? And that's what we just ran through.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
So let's move on to what will be hopefully a short but important main event, and that is predicting the content for the September, October, and November 2019 LSATs, the real heart of the crystal ball, so to speak.
Yeah, a different type of prediction, because now we can talk a little more specifically and with more confidence. The predictions before were just like, look, some things might go kind of upside down. This is more, here's what we can tell you for sure.
That's exactly right. So let's first off talk about these 3 tests as a whole. Do you think that any of these tests will be entirely new, or will they all be repeated tests, kind of reuses from the past?
Sure. And I can say with virtual certainty that the 2 disclosed tests, September and November, those will be new. Those are exams that they've created. They've tested with experimental sections on past tests. That'll be the first time they're ever put together as a real exam, in my expectation.
Most likely, yes.
Yeah, and then, of course, those copies will be floating around once the scores release. October, the black sheep among these three, because it's not going to be released, is a slightly different story, in my view. It could be new. It could be new, but I also think it's kind of ripe for a repeat, a reuse of a past test.
And what would you predict if you were to say it was going to be a repeat?
Well, since you're putting me on the spot, I will say this. There's a lot of options that they have in the vault still floating around, and they've shown obviously no great hesitation to use tests that they've reused previously. In fact, we see it over and over. I still think February 2017 has got a bullseye on it, frankly. That test has never been used again. It's sitting there. It's old enough now to make it viable to come back out. I still think that's a pretty strong candidate.
Especially for a big test group.
Yeah.
Like October would be.
Like July was, and then we thought maybe that's actually what would happen in July. Of course, it wasn't. But yeah, that test is going to get used again at some point, whether it's this year or next year. It's coming. I think October makes a pretty, attractive candidate for it.
And let's add one other, piece of information when we talk about like the test setup.
Mm-hmm.
You think that all these exams are going to have just a solo logical reasoning section as the experimental?
No, I think what we saw in July was a one-off weirdness that we will not encounter again. I think we're getting back to normal in the sense of test constructions when it comes to September, October, November. Obviously
Exactly.
Unusual in the sense of it's digital, but the content itself, I think we can expect this will be much more of the same June 2019 and prior.
Yeah, they need to go back to pre-testing RC and LG sections so
Yeah.
that they can use those on future tests. So that July scenario with just logical reasoning, we know why they did it, and it makes complete sense given what they're attempting to do with that test. So I think we go back to normal, as it were, in the future here. We'd expect that you could get any of the 3 section types as your experimental.
Yeah, and because I know you don't mind continuing to bring up July's experimental strangeness, credit one more time to you, Dave, because you were right about what actually happened there. It was a single section of experimental, as you said all along.
I did say that all along, and I'm
Yep.
still basking in the validation of being right. God, I love that.
I can feel your gloating coming over the airwaves.
Well, there was just such an uproar, and I heard so many wacky theories, and I was like, this is not the time to, do crazy things when you're actually in a transitional test. It is against the best practices to do that. It made 0 sense.
Yeah.
So
we did one of these for July, as I'm sure you recall, because it feels like it was just yesterday.
we did it as a webinar, though, so it's got all the visuals and
Yes.
the graphs. It's a little different to do it as a podcast because it's harder in one sense. We don't get to put the visuals
Right.
up and have it be instantaneously obvious what we're talking about.
Yeah, you don't see numbers and graphs and stuff here. Obviously, there's no visuals that go along, so you'll have to kind of imagine along with us. But if you want to check out some of the visuals of what we're about to talk about, I think that webinar that we did prior to July is probably a good place to go spend some time.
Yeah, that is the July Crystal Ball webinar,
Mhm.
and we'll link it in the PowerScore podcast page
Sure.
so that anyone can pull it up. And what we're going to do is we're really going to refine and hone the high points of what we expect to appear on each of these sections.
Yeah.
So we'll make it easy to digest from an oral standpoint. And then if you really feel like you need to see the visuals on it, we'll refer you back to the graphs from that July test, which cover the release tests up to this point.
Sure.
You want to tell us what's going to be on the logical reasoning section, the real experiment, or the real section, not the
Yeah,
experimental.
not the experimental, which I won't touch. It's always fascinated me a little bit in logical reasoning because there's 13 question types as we classify them, with a degree of looseness around that when you talk about things like principle. It's not a new question type, it's an idea, or separating most strongly supported from must be true. We group them together, that kind of thing. But roughly 13 question types or so. But really only 4 of them comprise about half the tests. And it doesn't catch me off guard anymore because I know it already. But I think it surprises some students that these things don't get equal treatment across the board. There's some real heavy hitters and there's some real outliers. So obviously we want to focus on the heavy hitters. Here are those 4 major question types that you must be solid with. The first is strengthen. Comes up all the time, usually around 8 per test, although there's a range or so, 7 to 9 typically. But if you think about it, that alone is a massive percentage of what you're seeing. 8 of the 50 questions or so. That's huge, man. 16 or so %. Obviously, within strengthen, you see a lot of causality as well, so it's important to recognize that underlying reasoning form. The other big one is flaw. Flaw in the reasoning, not even for its own sake, although there's usually 7 or 8 of these per test too, but also for the fact, and we talked about this, what was it, just last week, I think. We started to actually examine flaw in the reasoning questions and talk about categorical flaws. And we talk a lot in that episode about how important this is as an idea, as a skill. Your ability to recognize conclusions and see why they might fall short of perfect, that is going to reward you elsewhere too. Weakened questions, parallel reasoning. There's tons of other places that these flaw ideas manifest. So not only for its own sake, but also for the value elsewhere, really be good with those flaws. And if you haven't listened to last week's episode, I think it serves as a great introduction to this idea.
And we're going to continue on with that, too.
Yeah. In fact, next week we should have part 2 of that ongoing series of flaws. We'll see. Not to handcuff us, but apparently I just did. Sorry.
It's going to happen.
Yeah. Third of the 4, and no surprise here, is must be true. I don't know that I would argue this is the most important, but a good argument could be made for that, especially when we start to look at reading comp next, and how must be true features there. This is just, and Dave, I've heard you call it this is really the heart of the LSAT. Your ability to draw valid inferences from given information, and avoid mistakes, avoid uncertainties or falsehoods. If you can do that well on this test, you're already way ahead of the curve. There's usually, and must has been a little more variable within this set. There's usually about 6 of these per test, but I've seen it spike up to 11. I've seen it dip down to 3 or 4. But regardless, must is just such an important idea that must be true questions, and most strongly supported as part of that banner. You have to be good here. And then finally, in some ways very similar to must, assumption questions. These have varied a little bit too. In fact, I think the June test saw something of a departure for assumption questions. But normally there's about 6 or 7 of these, sometimes up to 8. Those 4 question types, and that's necessary assumption, by the way, and sufficient assumption. We talk about assumptions, we're really talking about assumption and justify as we qualify them. They're different types, but they fit together neatly as a package. So that's usually where the 7 to 8 come from. Yeah, what I was going to do is just give a rough tally then. That, of your 51 questions, is usually at least half, 25, sometimes 28, 30 of those 50 questions. Those 4 types make them up.
And that's actually really powerful, because if you're thinking about, I only have a week or 2 weeks before the test, what do I focus on? Well, focus on where you know you're going to get questioned. So that strength and flaw, must, and assumption grouping, as John said, half of the LR questions fall into that category. And you made an interesting comment there about what's the most important, because I was thinking about that while you were talking.
Sure.
And what I've often said about must is that it is the foundation of this entire test. Fact-finding is huge, not just to answer these questions, but obviously it helps answer main point questions.
Sure.
But if you're going to strengthen or weaken an argument, you need to know what the facts were. And so the ability to determine what must be true in an argument informs pretty much every type of question that you do. It has an impact on it in one way or the other, even if they're not asking you specifically about that strength.
Yeah.
So one of the first things I always check when I look over student results is, how did you do on must be true questions and then first family questions in general?
Sure.
Which is the same fact-finding expedition idea. And if someone is weak on must-be-true questions, I immediately am like, this is what we have to start with. Because you need to know what you read and understand what you read. Because if you don't, trying to determine what the flaw is or trying to determine how to weaken that argument is going to be much, much harder than it should be.
Yeah, it was the first thing we talked about in flaw, in fact, is what are the characteristics, the hallmarks of a correct answer in flaw? The very first thing it has to do to even have a chance is it has to accurately describe what you just read. It has to be true.
Yeah, and it is interesting, too, because these 4 question categorizations here, 2 of them, must and flaw, are connected, because one of them is just the details in a concrete way of finding the facts, and the other is the abstraction of that. And the other 2, the strength and an assumption, are all related as well about helping the argument in some way. And so what they're really telling you is they want to see you know what the facts were, and they want to see how well you can manipulate the information and determine what would best help the argument. These are very lawyerly things, so you can understand why they would be asking you to do this. Now, obviously, there's other question types out there that, don't occur nearly as frequently, and some of them are more variable than others.
Right.
But if you're going to spend your time in the last week, study must and flaw. Don't be studying cannot be true and evaluate. Study the things that you're going to see, not the things that only come up rarely but which might be scary, which is really thematically something that we'll see in logic games as well when we get to that.
Sure. Yeah, everybody's afraid of a circular game, but it can wait.
Well, until it shows up.
Until it shows up, and then you can write me hate mail.
Well, it's the same thing with cannot be true and evaluate. They're really weird question types. They can throw people off. I want you to know the basics of how to deal with it. Do you need to go study it for 10 hours? Not likely.
Yeah. If
If
somebody
you're trying
comes
to get
me
a
and they're
180,
like, right.
yeah, you better be rock solid on it. But that's not the case for most people. It's just not where you would, if from a triage standpoint, put your time that you have for studying.
That's a good word for it. If somebody comes to me and they're like, I struggle with flaw and I struggle with pointed issue, that's not even a conversation. Go study flaw, especially in your final days.
Well, especially also because the more you know about arguments and you're able to see the flaws, that'll actually come back and help you with pointed issue.
And evaluate, frankly, and basically everything else. Yeah. We agree.
Which is why we're doing this podcast series around this episode about flaws. So.
Yeah, there you go. You want to move on to reading comp?
Yeah, let's do that.
All right. Maybe the least interesting of the set, just because there's not a whole lot to say here. There's maybe two ways to look at this. Passage topic, subject matter, so to speak, and then the nature of the questions that get asked. Let's talk about both. It's been pretty consistent with passage topics on recent tests. What you typically have seen are two passages dealing in some form of humanities, sometimes a little more than two. I think over time it's been like 55% of the passages. So two and a sliver. But expect two of those. Humanities can be just about anything. Social sciences, it can be about a book or an author or some, political movement. It can be all sorts of different things that fit into that category. The history of perfume, you get it. But that's what they've done. Within humanities, we see certain elements, certain features occasionally rear their head, but not nearly as much or as well-defined, perhaps, in the past. This notion of under and overrepresented groups, diversity, as we talk about it, for instance. It's still an element there, but they tend not to devote quite so much attention to it as in years past. There's usually one passage on science, whether hard or soft. Soft science would be something like, tides, or something that people understand. A hard science would be something like, retroviruses, something that people typically don't know as much about. Regardless, usually one of those.
Yeah, tides could conceivably be a hard science topic.
Depending, what they do with it, Coriolis forces and things like that.
Yeah, there you go. But usually when you talk about soft science, they're talking about the impact of science on society.
Yeah.
Like gene splicing. How will it affect, how society
Designer
and culture...
babies, right.
Yeah, exactly. It's not so much about the actual gene editing that is required for something like that. That would be more towards the hard science idea.
That's what I'm holding out for, by the way. If you're wondering where my parenthood credentials are, I'm waiting for CRISPR editing to catch up. Yeah,
we're pretty close with CRISPR.
I know. Kid's gonna be a superhero. And then finally, there's almost always a law passage, something to do with courts or legal doctrine or the application of some principles legally, and that's exactly what you would expect on a test leading into law school. No surprise there. The good news in all of these is, regardless of topic, and I know we've said this before, but it doesn't hurt to hear again, there is no prior knowledge on your end required. This is a test that essentially is measuring how you react to information you're provided with, not what you already know. So they give you everything you need, whether it's on gene splicing or legal doctrines or, again, the history of perfume. They'll tell you everything you need. So that's been the passage breakdown, roughly.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I've had students say to me before, I really don't like, reading comprehension that much. And I will usually say something to the effect of, well, what about the law-related passages? How do you feel about those? Nah, I don't like those. And I always stop for a minute and I'm like, what do you think law school is going to be like?
Yeah, uh-oh.
If you're not enjoying reading about the law passages in an environment where it's actually been made more palatable and less dry, typically, not always, but in a lot of cases, when you get to law school, you're really going to be hating life. So that's one thing to think about. As usual with the LSAT, when you're studying this stuff, look to it from the perspective of what can I learn. A lot of the stuff, not always, but a lot of it is based upon reality. The other thing I'll point out is, remember that the studying that you do for logical reasoning has an impact on the studying that you do for reading comprehension and vice versa. A reading comprehension passage is, in a lot of cases, is like a gigantic logical reasoning question. They are typically built upon, first and foremost, knowing the facts of what you read. And so, as we move into the question types themselves, you see that reflected, this idea of like, you have to know what you read. Your whole goal in reading this is hopefully to enjoy it somewhat.
Right.
I mean, I actually believe that's a goal that you should have in mind. Is like, what can I get out of this? Should be interesting. Let me find out what these guys have to say. And then to be able to know what it was that they actually said. And you see this reflected in the questions.
Sure.
And so, John...
Yeah, that's a really good segue. To the former, I mean, when I read a reading comp passage, the first thing I do is almost like a healthy self-deception, where I just tell myself no matter what it's about, I'm going to learn something, this will be fun, one day at bar trivia, this is going to pay me back, that kind of thing.
You don't know how many bets that I've won at a bar over that Waterbugs passage.
I believe you. I know better than to bet against you, frankly.
It is 0.
Is it 0? I thought it was going to be at least 2 or 3.
No.
That passage in particular, maybe not. But yeah, I mean, there's some sort of knowledge imbued here. You're not going to learn anything from a logic game. Also, those are the 4 people in that photo album. You're not going to learn anything. But a passage can at least teach you something about the world, whether it's scientific or legal or whatever. And the second thing is you transition me into the questions here. It's a nice segue is, yeah, it's almost all must be true here. Almost everything you see in these questions is going to fall into a must be true type of format. Which is really just to say, as you described, use the passage as a giant stimulus. The question asked must be true, and then you're all about the facts. You're all about the details and the information you've just been provided with. We can talk a little bit, Dave, if you want, in the questions about the ways in which we break down reference points, like global reference, conceptual reference, specific reference. But really, I would do that, talk about those 3 types, just to say that almost about a half or so of what you see has been global reference, passage as a whole type questions. What's the main point? What is the author's attitude? What's the purpose? These kinds of questions.
Broad-based questions.
Right. Which of the following does the author mention as a reason for behind blah, blah, blah? These are big passages, a whole thing. So it's very important as you read that you get a big picture understanding of the text.
Yeah, and I think that's an important thing to reiterate. About 50% of the questions in reading comprehension in the last 3 years or so have been built around global reference questions, which is where they don't direct you to any part of the passage, they don't give you any real insight into what they're asking about. They instead say, the broad idea was this. And as you mentioned, it could be the point, it could be a purpose, It could be something the author said, what have you. That tells you that they expect you to get the big picture. And then the other thing that you mentioned, which I think is worth following up on, is the overwhelming majority. It's not like 60% or 70%. It's like 90% or more is built upon the idea of must-be-true questions, which is that fact-finding expedition. So when you go into reading comprehension, you should be thinking, I better know these details and the facts of what happened, and I for sure better understand the big picture of what they're actually doing. If you're able to do that, you are well on your way towards at least feeling comfortable with what it is that they're asking you about. It doesn't automatically make the questions easier, but as I spend my time preparing for reading comprehension and logical reasoning, if I'm not good at must-be-true questions and logical reasoning, do you think that's going to have an impact on your reading comprehension? You bet it will. And so I'd go back to my LR and really hone in on that, and you probably will see a trickle-down effect to reading comprehension. These things are connected. A lot of times people think, oh, each section is totally different. I'm like, no. Your conditional reasoning understanding and logical reasoning will affect your ability to do logic games.
Sure.
Your must be true is going to affect you in RC and LR. There's all sorts of connections like that we focus on in classes and that we talk about when we're tutoring students and so forth, but that aren't necessarily apparent to someone who's just studying on their own. And so you need to think about how these connections work, and one of the ways you can see it is what they emphasize from logical reasoning to reading comprehension to logic games. They're telling you what's important.
Sure. So there you go. Yeah, so that's reading comp. Passage types, question types, that's what you're going to see.
All right, let's move on to logic games.
Yeah, you want to take the lead on this?
Nah, I don't have anything to say.
Okay.
Yeah,
all right, well, it's been fun.
It was a good episode.
I'm off to pour this drink out.
Did you not drink it all?
No, I'm halfway through it. I'm down to 1.5 Wiseman.
I will say this: if anybody ever wants to make me throw up after drinking, try to give me one of these.
Yeah, I'm actually
I've
sweating. I'm sweating a
I've
little bit right now.
wizened up, and I will no longer take those shots. Let's put it that way. Let's move into logic games, though, because one of the nice things about games is how extreme it is in terms of what they focus on.
Yeah.
There are really two big skills in the logic games arena. One of them is linearity, which is lining things up and putting them in order. And if you've ever gone to, a concert or a movie or a sporting event, a restaurant, you end up lined up a lot of times waiting. Who's first, who's second, who's third, and then you get in order. That's what linearity is. About 50% of the games out there are linear related. Either they're basic linear or they're advanced linear. So about 35% of all games are basic linear, about 15% are advanced linear. Those two comprise half the games you're going to see. That's incredibly powerful. So John had mentioned before, like circular games. The so-called outlier games, which I'll come to in just a moment, they are very rarely tested. And if you have got a week or two before the LSAT, do not spend it on circular games other than to say, do I know what I'm doing with this? Oh yeah, I make the little bicycle spoke. I'm good. Move on. You don't need to study 10 hours worth of circular games. Chances are not great that you'll see one. Possible? Yes. Likely? No. So 50% of what you're going to see is linear related. The other big skill, grouping. And that is actually about 48% of the games that you see. So most of these are just straight grouping games. About almost 40% of the games that you're going to see are just straight grouping. How many people can we put together? And this is the other skill that you see in life. Hey, who do I want to invite to the party?
Right.
You don't invite them in order. Who is going to arrive first, then second? We may have that scenario in a logic game, but that's not how you think. You're like, all right, I want these people, I want those people. Oh, I can't invite them because they're enemies with them. That kind of thing. Although, at a certain point in life, you got to be like, whatever, you guys work it out. We want to party. We want to have a lot of people. Let's go. If you guys get into a fight, it'll just be more entertainment.
I like that philosophy.
Yeah, and then about 10% of the games out there are a combination of grouping and linear. So that kind of, if you add all that up, that's 98% of the games that you're running into are either grouping or linear or a combination thereof.
Sure.
So as you go out to study, spend your time on those game types.
Now, that's a historical percentage going back decades, but it's also held true over the last really 2.5 years as we look at recent tests too. So I think it's easy to pad numbers one way or another if you start to include outlier ideas, but these have held remarkably true.
Yeah, what's the phrase? Lies, damn lies, and statistics.
That's right.
You can make anything. You can manipulate the numbers to prove whatever you want. We're not trying to do that. We're actually just saying this is what they have done.
Sure.
And on that basis, they tend to do the same things going forward. That's always been the case. There are variances. There are 3 types of games that students generally consider to be like the outlier types or the more challenging types. And that would be pattern games, mapping games, and circular games. And they do show up. And when they show up, they can, wreak chaos and havoc because people are not prepared for them. I know when we go back to some of the tests in the past, when we were able to predict that one of the July tests from about 1.5 years ago was going to have a circular game or could very well have a circular game, I know a lot of our students felt much more comfortable having looked at that information beforehand.
Yeah.
But that doesn't really take more than an hour. And if you're struggling in logic games, this isn't where you would actually spend your time. If you are worried about that, what we will do is on the PowerScore LSAT podcast page for this episode, we will link to our blog that is a comprehensive list of the rarely tested outliers and oddball games.
Yeah, all the instances of these 3 types going back to 1991.
Which is really helpful. If you're kind of like a dominant logic games person, you're like, I'm really good at this. I expect to go 20 or more correct, but I'm worried about something weird happening. That's the time I would sit down and say, let me test myself on all the weird stuff. All the things that are not just basic linear and basic grouping concepts. It may not happen, but at worst, you'll feel even more dominant about your ability to deal with whatever they throw at you. If you're struggling with logic games, that is not the place to spend your time. It'll infuriate you and probably make you feel a little bit worse about logic games. So the other thing to really think about when you look at how they test you in the logic game section is it's not just about the game type. It's not necessarily about linear or grouping. There are certain features or solution approaches that these games will use. One of them is numerical distributions. And probably about 1 out of every 7 games, maybe 6 games, it really depends, it moves around, will feature a numerical distribution. And truly, almost every game has one, but a lot of times they're just 1 to 1 to 1 to 1, like a basic linear game. We're not counting those. We're talking about when something unusual is happening, like there's a group of 3, another group of 3, and a group of 2, but it's moving around. We're talking about something that is notably unusual and can be beneficial to understand. The other idea is how we actually solve these games. And obviously, one of our favorite techniques is to show templates and solutions. Amazingly enough, about 1 out of every 3 games is best solved using that approach. And sometimes you got to remember, it does take more time to set up a game showing all the different templates or solutions, but it allows you to go more quickly through the answer choices because you have, if not perfect information, you have a much greater degree of information about what you're looking at.
Sure.
And so, whereas I tell everybody from a game type standpoint, look at linear and grouping and just go hard on those, I always say don't forget distributions and possibilities because those are 2 more advanced ideas. When they show up, they can be, challenging, and it's certainly a lot more games than people realize are best solved by showing some form of the possibilities that are actually out there.
Yeah.
When you combine a focus on the 2 basic game types and then you add this in, you have a test taker who is largely ready for almost anything they might see that's not a true outlier and feels comfortable. It's like, oh, I know what to do here. And we had a recent episode where we talked about why would you actually choose to show templates or possibilities, what would trigger those. So if you're like, I'm not totally certain, go back and listen to that episode.
About to mention that. I'll mention one other thing too, with all of this game stuff, really with everything that we're talking about here. If you're one of our course students right now and you're listening to this, you're enrolled in a course currently running or maybe that just ended, or even one that hasn't started yet but you're signed up. We do weekly clinics and we've covered a lot of this game stuff already. An early clinic was on basic linear. A couple weeks later, we did one on advanced linear. The most recent one, last week, was on grouping games, undefined and partially defined grouping. The one next week is on numerical distributions and templates. So if you're listening to this as a student of ours right now, be sure to either sign up and come check that clinic out, or at least watch the video of it, watch the archive, because it really explores these ideas in further depth to supplement the course conversations.
Yeah, it's interesting. We don't often sit around and push the products that we work on a daily basis, but I know the clinics are a labor of love specifically for you.
Yeah.
You've done a lot of them. You've certainly created a huge amount of the content, but the feedback we've been getting from those clinics is awesome.
Yeah.
I love the new Digital LSAT course. It has taken a lot of the information and testing and put it online. We have our digital platform, which allows you to take tests using a digital interface that is similar to LSATs. You can do homework through that. It is very well adjusted for this new digital format, and it's not something that we get crazy about, woo, it's a great course, but I know that you and I are both very excited about a lot of the changes we've made for this test and the way this new digital platform allows us to help prepare people.
For sure. Yeah, it's been more love than labor, but a hearty amount of both, to be sure.
I know the labor that's gone into it. So.
Yeah. But, I mean, they're fun. They give us a chance, the clinics specifically give us a chance to engage with students live, online, and talk about things to really explore deeper, further beyond just the course content itself. So, for me, having taught this course God knows how many times, you too, it can feel a little automatic at times. A little pre-scripted. You know what you're going to say. You know what example you're going to give. But the clinics have been far more free-ranging and extemporaneous. And I don't get a chance to do that a whole lot. These podcasts are fun for that reason, largely. Because you and me in here just riffing. The clinics have been that.
Yeah, we tend to have general discussions, though. In these podcasts, these clinics tend to be much more specific. And they're
targeted,
built around specific LSAT questions.
Yeah. It's not me in there just rambling for 2 hours. There's... like the grouping when we did 3 really great grouping games last time and a whole introduction to how numbers factor into grouping in terms of definition and selection sets and all of it.
Yeah.
So again, if you're in a course or you're planning to take a course, that's going to be a feature you get access to. Take advantage.
Definitely.
Yeah.
All right. So if you summarize what we've said here about this exam and these upcoming 3 exams, the beautiful thing about it is that LSAC is very consistent. And they have to be. This is a standardized test. It's not Wild West kind of, things that they're doing. They have to test the same ideas in a very consistent fashion over time. And the reason for that is they need the results to be consistent over time. And that's what allows us to make these predictions. A lot of times people are like, oh, you guys nailed it. And I'm like, we should, because we're using a template that is well trodden, well proven, and needs to hold going forward. So when we start talking about like focus on linear and grouping, or focus on must be true and flaw and strength and assumption, it's because we know that they've done that in the past. We know they're going to do that again. So take those nutshell ideas, use that to focus your studying over the next few weeks before your test, and you're going to see these things on the exam for sure. It's it's a force of nature, and it's a truism.
Forces of nature. It's a little close to home at the moment, doesn't
it? Close off with a hurricane.
Hurricane joke. That's what we should be drinking, man. Hurricanes.
That was a mistake. We've missed that, because I like that drink quite a bit. God darn it, I hate it when I miss a good opportunity to link things together.
You got all night to go make a hurricane drink, buddy. I do want to reiterate why we did this, and I think you just summed it up pretty nicely. We get requests incessantly, dozens and dozens of times a week, to do these for every single LSAT that comes about. Obviously, there's not always something new to say, but I think there was enough new to say here, especially with this transition into a new digital world, that not only could we emphasize some of what we learned from July, but it never hurts to hear the real meat of what your test is going to contain, how to prioritize your studies based off of what you know LSAC prioritizes on the test itself. And that's really what the second half of this was. So hopefully that resonates for people and informs what you do next.
Exactly. And with these disclosed tests, when they come out, the first thing that we will do is break them down, take a look at them, make sure they matched up with what we expected. If there is anything unusual, we will certainly talk about it. If you don't already, follow John and myself on Twitter. This is where we will talk about, did they reuse a test from before? Is there something unusual on the test that's going on? Especially with the released exams, we get a chance to match what we thought versus what actually happened.
Right.
So that's where we will talk about it first. If it's required, we'll update the Crystal Ball seminar and do another one. We doubt that we will have to. And so if you're looking at this and you're like, well, I'm taking the November test, if we haven't updated this, that means that we expect it to be exactly the same as this. And that is most likely what's going to occur here. So keep that in mind.
Yeah, I think so too.
All right, that brings us to the close of another episode. I hope everybody enjoyed that. If you get a chance, please subscribe to this podcast on iTunes, Spotify, or YouTube, or any other platform where you can find it. Give us a rating as well. And if you have any questions, you can send those to lsat@powerscore.com or lsatpodcast@powerscore.com. For everybody out there on the southeast, stay dry, stay away from heavy winds. And for everybody else, I hope you have a great week, and we will talk to you soon.